Hello, welcome back to Leftist Labor History. My name is Nate and I am the host. And this is part 2 of our episode 6. So we're covering post-World War II period. We're going to go from, what did I decide here? Let's say, 1947 to 1981. And we're going to get to, we decided, I've decided to end this era in 1981 because that is when Ronald Reagan fired the striking PATCO union members, the air traffic controllers. And I think that's a good way to end this era. But obviously I'm going to get to that. Starting in 1947, because that was the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act. So that basically replaced the Wagner Act of 1935. And so that became, the governing legislation for labor unions, organized labor, and it weakened a lot of the Wagner Act provisions. It opened up the ability for states to declare themselves right-to-work states. So basically, in a right-to-work state, you cannot have a closed shop. So this episode is about deindustrialization. It's not my favorite term, definitely not. It's not strictly accurate. These companies weren't. These companies did not really move away from heavy industry, but it's the term that we use. So basically what that means, so when you hear deindustrialization, what it means and what you should think is that these companies began a process of decentralizing their operations. So if you get, kind of Gilded Age, turn of the century through to, the 40s with the World War II effort, you get a lot of centralization of factories and workers into these cities in what we now, think of as the Midwest and like Ohio. And deindustrialization is the reversal of that process. They're moving their plants out to the suburbs, and more dramatically, they're moving operations to the Sun Belt. So they're moving operations to Atlanta, and they're moving to Phoenix, Arizona, Texas, Southern California, Orange County. They're moving south. This is made possible in part by the advent of air conditioning. It's just too damn hot to survive in Phoenix, Arizona without air conditioning. So this is what companies are doing. This is what auto manufacturers are doing. Steel plants, that sort of a thing. They're moving their operations out from the cities. Why are they doing that? Well, so the reason they give is that we're going to make things more efficient. So a big part of deindustrialization is automation. So they're investing a lot of capital into these new technologies, robotics, automating a lot of their production lines. So just to give you an idea of the scale of this, between 1946 and 1956, General Motors spent $3.4 billion on new plants and facilities, and Ford spent $2.5 billion on new plants. It's big money, right? Big chunk of change. The other big reason for this is a way to combat the hold that organized labor has on these industrialized cities. So if you kind of if you build a plant in Atlanta or in Houston, Texas or whatever, it's going to be expensive, but you can move your upper management to that plant this is all almost all white people. You're going to move your management to these plants, and you're going to hire, whoever lives there. Those people are not going to be unionized in large part, right? So you're investing a lot of money. You're building new factories and investing money in automation, but they're doing this because they're getting around organized labor. And this is not coincidentally, this is also the era of white flight. So white people are moving to the suburbs. They're moving out of cities. So first part of the 20th century, cities are these kind of industrial wonders, and this is like very futuristic and modern. And then as you get into the 60s and 70s, cities kind of become the sites of like urban decay and blight. And weirdly enough, right, like when the white people move out of the cities, now, state and municipal and federal governments don't want to invest in cities. It's weird how that works out, right? So in terms of timing, right? So in terms of how we understand this period, the golden age of labor, the so-called golden age of labor, is going to last, through the 70s, right? So in 1979, you actually have, in terms of membership numbers, you have the peak of union membership at 21 million workers, right? That's a big portion of workers. But this is actually, in terms of union density, in terms of the percentage of workers, this is actually down from the peak in 1954 at 35%, which is, that's amazing. In terms of private sector unionship, in terms of private sector union membership, that is a number that we're like below 10%, I think, currently. So what do we make of that? Well, my way of thinking of this is that you can think of like the Wagner Act, I guess. We'll pinpoint it at the Wagner Act. You can kind of think of like the Wagner Act, for lack of a better kind of point. It's almost like the Big Bang, right? So that kind of sets off this explosion of union membership. And as soon as possible, so 1947, right? So as soon as the war is over and capitalists gain a measure of control again, away from this huge organized mass of workers, they begin to try to rein it in. But that it's still on that trajectory, of people moving upwards, of union membership going upwards. And it really doesn't kind of hit that plateau until the late 70s. And then by the 80s, you start to see the drop off, and kind of symbolically, then it's like, okay, we've really turned a corner. But I do want to point out that as soon as possible, right, capitalists are fighting labor, are fighting union membership. But because it had gained so much steam and so much momentum, it's really going to have a lot of influence, a lot of power for a couple more decades before it's able to they're able to curb that. Okay, so I want to talk about Uaw Local 600. So I think I mentioned them before, but I want to bring up a little bit of their history. Anyway, so this little episode, this is just an example. This is not. I want to preface this by saying, this is not some like big important chapter in U.S. labor history, but it does give us a little window into what's going on at the time and the kind of the decisions that organized labor made during this time. Local 600 operates out of Ford's River Rouge plant in Dearborn, Michigan. And this was built in the 30s, and this was this huge new. Again, this is you get this kind of centralization of technology and industry. This is an example of that where Ford has like built this new state of the art plant and everything, and it employs a ton of people right? And Local 600 has 60,000 members, in 1951. A third of whom are black. There are a lot of communists in the union. There are communists in the leadership of this union. This union is starting to go rogue, and it gets, relative to other union locals, it's got a bit of leeway because it is so big. Like, it's just got so much pull, and it starts doing wildcat strikes, which are strikes that are not authorized by leadership in the International, and it's got an alliance with the National Negro Labor Council. So it's a bit more of a radical union. It's got a lot of black support, and it is at odds with the top brass in the UAW. In 1951, and they do this kind of on the sly, but they sue Ford for breach of contract. What was happening is Ford, kind of like what I had been talking about, they were investing in automation, and so they put a bunch of automation into the River Rouge plant, and the union says, this is a breach of contract. You are undercutting our right to work. We have a right. Part of this contract is we have a right to a job, basically. That's an audacious claim to take to court. They did not win. But what is notable about this is they're kind of doing this without support from the International. And so between the 30s, where you have radical unionists fighting Pinkertons and fighting cops and the National Guard, in the 1950s, you get a change there, right? You have a radical union local, but they're really kind of the last gasp of this radical unionism. And the International, the UAW, they don't want anything to do with this, right? Like, this is a losing battle. They're more interested in being in the boardroom and negotiating with the NLRB there, and they're talking to who's president? Eisenhower, I guess. Eisenhower's probably not working with them very much, but they're like in Washington. They're in the boardrooms. They're not going to invest their resources in this kind of in this losing battle. In the U.S., you're not going to make a case in the courts that you have a right to a job. It's just not going to shake out. But they did it. Personally, I got enough respect for them that they gave it a shot, and that they were a cool union local, that I have a little UAW Local 600 pin. So I have another pin here. This is a real object lesson. I'm a real object lesson ass today. This is Communications Workers of America, AFL-CIO. Social Security deductions from pensions unfair, right? So this is the kind of thing. I just happen to have that, but I just think it's interesting. It's like, that's your rallying cry by the 60s, right? Let's go get them, boys. Social Security pensions, Social Security deductions from pensions unfair. You got the Wobblies, you don't need your boss, the boss needs you. You got that kind of radical rhetoric happening, decades before. And then this is the kind of thing, this is the kind of thing that organizers are trying to organize around, is like your tax deductions. And it's just a different world, right? It's a different environment. Anyway, so my point, just to reiterate my point with that lawsuit, is you've got, by 1951 or so, or thereabouts, you've really kind of, gotten the last of the radicals out of organized labor. Now it's like suit and tie stuff. And in hindsight, Was that a mistake? Well, we know that something went wrong. I'm going to kind of revisit that because this hold that organized labor had, this power that they had, waned, and so if that's something that they did, well, maybe we can point to this kind of juncture where they're not willing to pursue a radical agenda anymore, and they start to lose power. I don't know. Anyway, so during the same period. And I was reluctant to try to, I could have tied this in with the other part of the episode, part one, where I talk about the civil rights movement, but I didn't want to kind of reduce all of the culture war stuff to the civil rights movement. In fact, I didn't want to reduce civil rights as a concept. I didn't want to reduce, the struggle against racism to the civil rights movement as a thing. I just didn't want to kind of muddy the waters there, and so I stayed away from that. But during this period of deindustrialization, during this period of white flight to the suburbs, a lot of this is bolstered by a backlash to the idea of civil rights, to the demands that civil rights movement leaders are making, and the gains that they're making, right? So when we see black people get rights, when we see women get more rights, there's a backlash. It makes people really uncomfortable. A lot of the people have their privilege directly threatened, and they fight to keep it. And so you get this backlash, and this backlash is not, we think now, we tend to think of labor unions as like this inherently progressive or leftist thing, and that's not the case, right? I talked about how, Teamsters were strikebreakers against the UFW. And in fact, in 1970, the Teamsters endorsed Richard Nixon for president. I think that they were the only major labor union to endorse Nixon in 1970. You've got the civil rights movement. You've got Vietnam happening. Vietnam is pulling the entire country, including organized labor, in opposite directions, right? You kind of you're for it or against it, basically. This rift exposes people's most deeply held beliefs, right? So one thing that happens during the 60s is you get the president of the AFL-CIO, George Meany. It comes out, Walter Reuther's brother, Victor, leaks this to a journalist in an interview. It turns out that the AFL-CIO was actually funding right-wing efforts in Latin America to thwart unionization. Right. So a lot of people are pissed. There's a reason why they're doing that on the sly, because they know that this is not going to be popular. But still, there is this protectionist impulse to organize labor. And George Meany is not what you would call a conservative, right? But this idea of kind of U.S. empire is just so deeply implanted into American society. But anyway, so if you ever hear the AFL-CIO referred to as the AFL-CIA, well, it kind of comes from this kind of willingness to work with the CIA. They were partnering with the CIA in undermining organized labor in Latin America. And this is of piece with what's happening in Vietnam, right? The Vietnam War is an anti-communist kind of imperialist war. Walter Reuther, who I keep going back to, so he was against the war kind of personally. He did not speak up against it because he's in a position where he's working with Lyndon Johnson, right? So Lyndon Johnson, who is a formidable presence, right? He would throw his weight around, and you didn't really want to cross this guy. But Lyndon Johnson was like, hey, you got to support me on this. They're saying, XYZ. I need the support of big labor. by the late 60s, Reuther kind of splits from that and starts speaking out against the war, especially as it gets more and more unpopular, right? By the late 60s, it's... Anyway, so another example of this is in New York, you've got an anti-war demonstration, and construction workers, unionized construction workers, come out to the demonstration and start beating up the protesters, right? So another example of this kind of culture war rift, where it does not skew along labor lines by any means. There are a lot of conservative leaning unionists. Okay, so all of this leads to the election of 1980. So the Air Traffic Controllers Union, PATCO, they endorse Ronald Reagan. By 1981, they go on strike, and they're a public sector union. So this is an illegal strike, right? Technically, public sector employees have different rules that they are governed by. There's definite rules where strikes are legal or not. It's hard to kind of get an authorized strike, and so this is an illegal strike. But still, public sentiment is largely with these strikers, right? These are workers, and they have legitimate grievances, and people are like, nobody really expected Reagan. So what Reagan does is, in response to this strike, he fires all of the strikers, and he's within his legal right to discipline them in some way because their strike is illegal. He fires them, and that sends a real message, right? So this is a significant moment where it's like, okay, the president is not going to put up with organized labor anymore. The country's really taken a turn. This is a punctuation mark on the end of big labor, more or less. So we end there. And this kind of, we're going to go into, so the next and final episode is going to be Neo-Liberalism. So we're going to enter that era with the election of Reagan, the firing of the PATCO strikers, and the rise of Silicon Valley. But I want to pause here and offer some, let's get some takes, right? So let's do a roundup of takes from labor historians about what happened, right? There was so much promise, there was so much power to organize labor, and by 1981, a lot of it was gone. Well, I'm going to read this quote by Melvyn Dubofsky, who is a notable labor historian. This is from the conclusion of We Shall Be All, which is his book about the Wobblies. Dubofsky writes, as a result of their commitment to ultimate revolution, as well as to immediate improvements in the existence of the working class, radicals the world over quickened the emergence of strong labor unions and acted as midwives at the birth of the welfare state. But success, instead of breeding more success, only produced a new working class enthralled with a consumer society and only too willing, even eager, to trade working class consciousness for a middle class style of life. The ultimate tragedy then for all radicals, the American Wobblies included, has been that the brighter they have helped make life for the masses, the dimmer has grown the prospect for revolution in the advanced societies. Right, so he's basically saying what happened to big labor, the labor movement was workers got a house and 2 cars and a stable livelihood and, lost their zeal for revolution. I think there's something to this. I mean, I respect Dubofsky. I mean, he's an expert, and I'm going to defer to his expertise on this. But at the same time, I mean, I think, I mean, he's working from a Marxist frame, right? So advanced societies is a bit of a tip off there, where Marx thought that, you know, we're going to see an evolution from capitalism to socialism. It's going to happen in the most advanced societies. And that, you know, there's like this kind of intrinsic working class consciousness that automatically exists. I think he's, if I may, right, I don't really buy this, you know, this transition to this consumer society, you know, sapped big labor. I don't think that there were all that many workers to begin with that necessarily wanted revolution, right? So you can look at the 80s and say, oh, well, you know, everybody got what they wanted. They got the nice suburban home. But I think a lot of workers were revolutionaries, you know, out of convenience or out of opportunity rather than some, you know, commitment. Just my take. But I do think, again, I mean, I'm sharing this quote because I do think it is something to think about and something to consider, right? This idea that big labor was a victim of its own success. I'm not gonna read quotes, but I'm gonna kind of paraphrase a couple other historians. So Erik Loomis wrote a book called A History of America in 10 Strikes. And in the introduction, he lays out a kind of thesis, you know, rather clearly. Organized labor does not make any progress, doesn't make any inroads unless it has the government on its side, right? So he's got this conception of labor and capital, and they're fundamentally at odds. No surprise there. But really what tips the scale is the government's decision to side with labor or side with capital. I really can't refute that. And looking at it, it's like I have no evidence that labor can really effectively combat capital without the government stepping in and kind of mediating that. So I think that's fine. I don't know how useful that observation is, but I can't really disprove it. There is another labor historian, Yale Nicholson, and he wrote a book, Labor Story in the United States, and I would recommend that with qualifications. I like the book. I like that he goes, you know, he gives us kind of more of a fuller picture of labor. He doesn't just look at organized labor. I've adopted that frame for this series. It's a good read, but it's a bit dense. It's a bit academic. But if you're okay with that, by all means, pick up Labor Story in the United States by Yale Nicholson. Anyway, so his approach, he's you know, further left than Erik Loomis, who Loomis I would kind of describe as a New Deal Democrat, and Nicholson is a bit more of a Marxist. So his theory on labor, on this kind of history of organized labor, is that organized labor really only makes progress when capital decides that it's in their interests to let that happen. So this is really leaning on the idea that the New Deal was an effort to save capitalism, again, which I believe, I accept that. I think it's a bit nuanced and complicated, but I think that was the big impulse. I'm friendly to this argument, and at the same time, reading his book, I'm not convinced. So, I mean, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, right? Based on my own observations and my own understanding, it might very well be the case, and maybe it's just too uncomfortable for me to think about, but I don't know. I don't know. Anyway, so there are a few ways to kind of make sense of this process where organized labor lost power in the United States. And I present those to you, and just things to think about. I mean, also, I should say, I don't know that there's going to be any one kind of silver bullet theory that's just going to explain everything in one fell swoop. But I think it is worthwhile trying to figure out, where big labor came from and where it went and what happened to it. Anyway, so that wraps up this episode. Thanks for joining. And please tune in for the final chapter in my version of U.S. labor history, in which we'll look at neoliberalism. Okay.